I'd like to think that this channel has become a hub of decent to good writing and world-building advice, but you know what's really fun and almost as useful? Bad writing advice. There's a whole channel about it, but today I'm going to try my hand at imparting unto you the worst writing advice I have ever heard. Some that you've probably heard before, and some so startlingly brain-dead you probably haven't come across them, but I'm going to give my own takes on how to make all of these bad pieces of advice into something that is maybe useful. And I like keeping with themes on this channel, especially when they run between episodes, so the first piece of writing advice I shall implore you not to follow is Part 1, Every Story is the Hero's Journey. Last video we talked extensively about the hero's journey and how, while it may be useful for the categorization of certain stories, it is not, in fact, deterministic towards whatever story may come to exist. That video exists if you want that elaboration on that topic, but my focus now is on your experience of the hero's journey. Namely the fact that the way you may have heard about it, like me, was as it being a way to describe every narrative that there is. The Rosetta Stone of stories, if you will. And you could at this point fairly say, but J-Bat, the hero's journey is great writing advice for new beginners. It keeps them organized. And while the anti-J-Bat may have a point, the damage in teaching people to view the hero's journey this way is that it becomes a prescription rather than a description to apply to narratives. It feels like a big revelation the first time you hear about it. It'll often be paired with convincing enough examples, the ones I keep seeing being The Matrix and A New Hope. These are great examples of quality stories that follow the hero's journey essentially beat for beat. And you might think to yourself, man, A New Hope and The Matrix are really different. If those things follow this to a T, I guess everything does. And that's where the danger can come. Because from that point, enlightened by your secret knowledge of the truth behind all narrative, you go one of two directions. You may be discouraged and fall too far into the nothing new under the sun way of thinking and decide there's no point in pursuing the craft. For in following that logic, everything has been done and all stories are exactly the same. This can be a difficult rut to get out of, even though it can be disproven fairly easily, and does no good for your mentality or ability to actually get anything done, of course. Alternatively, you might decide that with this newfound brilliance of the hero's journey, you'll discern how everything you engage with secretly actually is based off the hero's journey, even if the connections you draw become increasingly nonsensical and vague to the point of meaninglessness. And the shame about this piece of advice, and the reason I speak about it both first and at length, is because it's disappointingly easy to fix. Simply saying many stories fit the hero's journey, or even saying the hero's journey is a good guideline that many famous narratives have followed, are actually good pieces of advice. But saying everything is the hero's journey, or sort of overstating its importance or prevalence, is catchier and more appealing at first as an idea, and that's of course why it gets purveyed so much. But to change directions, I'm going to move on to part 2, Everyone is out to steal your ideas. This one is not so much writing advice that you'll hear from professors or tutors as much as it's an idea that is passed around almost constantly between fellow writers. I hear it all the time and I see it all the same, and I've complained about people saying this in probably at least half a dozen videos at this point. But in this case, I can expound fully on why this is a bad mindset to have and hopefully leave the topic to rest thereafter. It's very easy to explain why this attitude is so pervasive. It's because almost universally, writers view what they're working on as extremely precious. It's something inherent to you that rests at the core of your soul. It's an expression of things you see and feel about the world that you'd never really just explain to somebody in words, but instead wish to show through the medium of storytelling. The story itself is something you specifically want to tell, the themes or ideas you want your audience thinking about. The characters almost become like old friends. And the thought of someone taking that from you, of sucking it down and spitting it out as if it was them who cooked it, it's a horrifying idea, like letting someone reach into your heart and pull a chunk out. Viscerally angering and painful in equal measure. It's only natural that this is something people fear. Sometimes that fear also becomes they're gonna take it and publish it and make millions. But usually that expression of this concept is a lot less justified for reasons that are both obvious and will be made more so. The core problem with this mindset is that it shuts you out from seeking honest feedback from people who could help your work become something good. The belief that anytime you show your work to someone they might steal it is also going to often coincide with extreme sensitivity to feedback or criticism, which itself is about the most self-destructive quality you can have as a writer, bar none. All of this is so important because absolute single-mindedness is not something humans do super well. You can find it in a lot of contexts and all sorts of situations, but in general, people don't tend to get things done absolutely on their own. Single people can be the primary mover of something getting done, but there will always be something that they either did or should have gotten advice from others on. Have you ever wondered why the quality or even just quality control of prolific writers and creatives in general can kind of get worse over time? It's because they get to a point of fame where nobody is willing nor finds any value in actually critiquing them anymore. The people who would have edited their work and offered pushback at a certain point decide either that they don't know enough to critique someone so acclaimed, or if it's from the point of view of publishers and agents and that sort of thing, that there's no need to spend money editing something that will sell extremely well regardless. A great example of this, as sad as it makes me, would be the prequel movies in Star Wars. I know, I'm the generation that grew up with them. I'm supposed to think they're perfect, but I don't think they're perfect. I do really love them, and I'd even say for all its various flaws, Revenge of the Sith is still one of my favorite movies. But on any objective scale, the movies do have plenty of problems. And that comes down to the fact that there was no voice of reason for George Lucas at a certain point. A New Hope was regarded by many to have been saved by edits made by George Lucas's then wife. With Empire Strikes Back, the movie pretty generally regarded as being the best Star Wars movie. Lucas did the writing, but others did the directing and the actual screenplay. On Attack of the Clones, which I consider to be kind of the roughest of the prequels, Lucas is back in the director's chair, and from what I've read was in a lot more direct control than in some of the previous movies. I don't think Lucas is bad at being a creative. I mean, if he was, Star Wars wouldn't be something we all know and typically at least like. But he in particular needed to delegate his work more than he did. So what does this have to do with people thinking their work's going to get stolen? Why did I ramble about a 40-year-old movie series? Because the people worried about their work being stolen aren't even there yet. They're perfectly able to find someone who will earnestly edit them, if they go looking at least, and they're too afraid to do it. I didn't bother explaining why you don't actually need to worry about your ideas being stolen because the reasoning is extremely obvious. If it's ideas that get stolen, the thief would then still need to write the full story, one they only understand another person's interpretation of in any case. And that's harder than just doing it by yourself with your own ideas. Spite for the person they stole from isn't going to make them bother to finish the project. And if your work is done or has significant progress, then you do, as far as I understand, legally own it anyway. So even if they do something untoward, which they still wouldn't because there's no actual incentive to do so, because manuscript theft is not a lucrative business by any definition, you could still resolve even that situation pretty easily. Please do not be afraid to share your work with people who want to help you. It can only benefit you, especially if you're actually willing to listen to what they say. And now for a piece of good advice, that is going to be using today's sponsor, World Anvil. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction genres. Keeping track of all relevant information, from characters to countries to magic systems, can be tricky, and it's very easy to get disorganized. However, World Anvil provides a solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world building needs, making it easy to get your information down and, most importantly, kept in order. If you need templates to keep track of character information, interactive maps, templates for magic systems, or even timelines, World Anvil can help you get them together all in one place, so everything you need is easily accessible. Especially considering that the lore and histories of fantasy or other speculative worlds can get very detailed and complicated, it's really helpful to have all of these visual indicators and resources. Altogether, it can really get you that sort of wiki vibe where all your world building is part of one ecosystem. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Once again, that's code JBAT for 51% off the annual plan, and thank you for not skipping the ad. After that, we'll try a rapid fire part 3 of some bad truisms. And those are write what you know, follow the muse, and show don't tell. These ones are pretty simple to explain, so I don't think they deserve full parts really. they fall into the single sentence truism pit where you get a sentence that almost means something useful, but it's too vague to account for the nuances that it actually make it mean something of value. But the first we'll tear into real quick is write what you know. What this means in practical terms is that you should write about dynamics and situations that you understand from your personal experiences. This isn't a worthless sentiment. A story about a soldier going through a war will probably gain a positive element from a writer who themselves has been in war. Assuming this writer is in any way competent, they may be able to convey some of their unique experiences within the narrative. Writing romance or romantic situations gets a lot easier after you've been in a successful relationship. These can be true while at the same time not being prescriptive. Philip K. Dick was never a cop in a dark, dystopic San Francisco, but he didn't need to be to write Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Mark Danielewski never explored a weird non-Euclidean house to write House of Leaves, or do any of the other things that that book does, and didn't need to. Saying you can only write what you know is reductive and only means anything if you essentially rewrite it to say, pull from your own experiences to enhance your writing, which is useful, but also very obvious. Crime and Punishment, which I love deferring to for many things, I know, is so effective in part because Dostoevsky didn't murder anybody with an axe. He did, spoiler for the novel, spend time in prison and was almost executed one time, and he had to mentally deal with that. Pulling from your experiences can help, but if it was the only thing you can do, only memoirs would be written and fiction wouldn't exist. As for Follow the Muse, this essentially falls on the path of write what you feel like when you feel like it. This sounds like good, kind of feel-good-y advice, and under specific circumstances it can be. Those specific circumstances are if you only pursue creative projects at a basically recreational level, something you do just for enjoyment's sake, which is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it. But if any part of your motive for pursuing creative works is centered on getting things done in reasonable amounts of time, then following the muse is going to result in you getting led into a rut in which you'll be stuck, because the muse is rude and will stand you up and just disappear on a whim. You cannot rely on mere motivation to get anything of significant length finished. You just can't. If you're new or just starting to work on something, you might think, I know I will want to write this all the way to the end and see it through. And that will be true for a little while. It might even get you maybe halfway there or so. But there's going to come a time when you sit down and just don't want to do it. You might want to give your brain a break and mindlessly scroll. And so you do. And then you never really work on it significantly again because you've allowed yourself to get set up to write and then pulled away from it, and now your motivation is on something else. The second project, a new one, the one that you'll definitely finish that's better, and this time it'll get to completion, no doubt. Needless to say, this cycle is not very useful to you. Few things are a must when writing, but discipline is a must. If you want to get done, you've got to set time aside, you've got to be willing to reach that time and sit down, even if you're not really feeling it, and work. Even if all you do is stare at a blank page, if you're trying, you're still doing more good for yourself than you would have by getting up and doing something else. Because the next time you do sit down at your scheduled time, if you kept up with it, even on times when it was hard, you'll probably actually get a lot more done. And you'll feel good about it too. But without that discipline, there isn't going to be a next time that you sit down and work on it. And the more you make excuses for not making progress when you know that you should, the easier those excuses are going to become to make, and the harder it's going to be to actually commit. And finally, of this little midsection rapid fire, show, don't tell. This one is back to being that ultimate example of saying something while really not saying anything. Is it better to say that John Characterton smiled as he took a bite out of the pancake than to say, John ate the pancake happily? Sure, it is more descriptive. Implementing sensory details, especially ones that aren't just based on sight, is a great way to add flavor to a story. The stench of a garbage-strewn alleyway, the whine of a helicopter's engine, the citrusy sweetness of a fresh orange. These are details you want to write about. But if, every time dialogue happens, you write something like, I think giraffes are heartless creatures, John said before he smiled, rubbed his nose, stuck his hands in his pockets, rocked back and forth on his heels, blinked exactly 3 times, tilted his head, and sniffed a few times. If that's what all of your dialogue descriptions sound like, then obviously you're just going to annoy the audience even more than if you just said, he said happily. He said happily is still non-descriptive and not something you really want to use, but sometimes you can just tell the audience something. Sometimes something being quicker is just worth doing. And sometimes there are other things in a scene that are worth getting that description more. You can say a new customer enters the store and he looks unhappy. Could you focus on his furrowed eyebrows, sullen expression, downturned chin? Sure. But do you need to? Not if there's something else that is more worth the reader's time. That's more worth that focus. Ironically, this one would probably be more useful if it was phrased as, show when it's important, tell when it's appropriate. But that isn't catchy and is only maybe one notch less vague, but it'd still be more helpful than show don't tell, as it being the most commonly given piece of writing advice means that most people end up overcorrecting into that deluge of realistically unimportant body language descriptors that we had with John Characterton. Part 4 is for the 2 worst character-related pieces of advice I hear, those being protagonists must be likable, and antagonists can't just be evil. There is something of a fear amongst newer writers that writing characters that aren't perfectly likable is going to deter potential audiences. This one can be kind of true. Likability can definitely matter under certain circumstances and for certain kinds of stories. If the audience needs to like a character for a certain effect within the story to work, it can be worth going out of your way to pursue that with some sort of save the cat moment, as we tend to hear them called. However, even if you do want to elicit sympathy out of the audience towards your character, they don't need to be likable. Just interesting and not super hateable. Making likable characters may not be that important, but making your audience not actively hate your protagonist is generally going to be something you want to do. You probably could write a story in which the enjoyment comes from watching a hateable protagonist get their comeuppance, but it's not typical. A Confederacy of Dunce's protagonist, Ignatius, is pretty unlikable. He's like a 4chan user before 4chan, but there are just enough miserable things about his situation and just enough amusing things he does that even though you might acknowledge that being around him in real life would be absolutely miserable, you still don't necessarily want to see bad things happen to him. And more importantly, you might hope for him to improve as a person. And there's no denying that the amateur hot dog salesman he is interesting, which is what keeps the audience actually reading about him. As for antagonists not being able to just be evil, this is a sort of long downstream effect that probably could have its own full discussion that would almost immediately be veering into topics of moral nihilism and its effects on the modern concepts of evil or something like that. We don't really have the time to make that digression right now, but maybe we'll get there one day. For our purposes right now, we're just going to talk about a sort of artificial spectrum for the evil of villains. On one end you have the mustache twirlers, and on the other you have ones that are closer to understandable fallen heroes. Villains that are full mustache twirlers that have no redeeming qualities whatsoever and abuse every person that surrounds them, that do evil for evil's sake, actually can work, but typically better if they're not acting as much of a personality in the story and more like a force. Sauron is a little bit like this. He isn't that much of a character as we see him in Lord of the Rings, but once you get down to making a character like that a person, then you have to work a lot harder to not make them seem like evil McBadguy and his child-crushing machine. Not something you can take very seriously. Even truly evil human characters need to have redeeming qualities in some way. Typically the ability to at least not make everyone they interact with hate and want to betray them, but probably to fear them. McCarthy villains like Anton Chigurh and the Judge tend to be this way in eliciting fear rather than hatred, despite being very evil. However, there's a bit of a tendency to only write antagonists that are more like anti-heroes than actual villains, and those are fine, though often tainted with the same problems morally gray protagonists are, namely a poor balance of what actually makes that personality balance believable. But I do have a way to conceive of antagonists that maybe gives you an easier way to control where they fall on this spectrum. There's an old Norm Macdonald bit about how dogs are capable of unconditional love, unlike people, and that there was a dog out there that loved Hitler more than anybody.
They don't judge dogs. We judge, all our love comes with caveats, there's no such thing as unconditional love with human beings. But dogs, they don't care. They love. Hitler had a dog. Now you think of that. I'm no fan of Hitler.
Much like Norm Macdonald, but saying that, there is some wisdom here, especially for writers. Even thoroughly, undeniably evil people, however you feel best defining the concept of evil, have some aspect in which they are human. As a monk from 1500 years ago, Augustine said, even though I'm simplifying it, evil isn't itself a substance. You can't be full of evil, but you can be absent of good, at least in most ways. I might digress to say that I think this actually is, if you read that writing, a fair way to conceive of the subject. But even should you disagree, it's really useful for writing. Even your terrible villains should have a tiny bit of humanity to them. Even if it's trivial, kind of meaningless good, that makes the evil more substantial by comparison, much like the mustache man and his dog. But that brings us to the close of this discussion for now, though there is plenty more bad advice out there, and I might talk about it again before too long into the future. Before I take my leave, however, I do have a channel announcement. The schedule will be changing. The camera will be improving. The production value and editing will be getting better and more thorough. Topic matters will be shifting, though not 100%. These improvements, however, are not without a trade-off. We're going to be posting once every 2 weeks as opposed to the current once per week schedule. This is risky, and I'm kind of afraid to do it, but I think it's the right move to bring you guys better quality content. Any support you offer is greatly appreciated, particularly just watching the videos. And here's hoping this works out. Anyway, that will do for today. In addition, every like and subscription goes a really long way. We have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond Dawn, Sadako, and Cavalier of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Avion and Jodion Void, our knights, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, one more piece of bad advice. Apparently there are actually people out there who say not to revise. That is insane. Do not listen to that. It's so bad that it wasn't even worth a portion of the video. Goodbye, have a nice day.